Today I'll be talking about inequality for women and girls in Colombia. I will approach this from a few frames of reference. I'll briefly explain general inequality as far as education and economic outcomes are concerned. And then I'll move on to a few potential solutions to these issues of gender equality, like inclusion of women in peace talks and helping women build organizations for advancement. The Colombian Constitution of 1991 established some benchmarks for women's rights. According to the Constitution, women should have full body integrity and autonomy, ability to vote and hold office, work outside the home, make fair wages, and have equal access to education. While the Constitution guarantees these rights in name, many would describe Colombia as a very male-dominated, machista society. Women are dependent on their male family members, and their roles outside the home tend to be limited. Maybe the worst part for women in this machista society is violence. In 2014, there were around 1,000 cases of femicide, 40,000 cases of spousal violence, and 16,000 cases of sexual abuse. Nearly 90% of those reported sexual abuse cases were against children and adolescents. One group of women unique to world feminist struggle is the FARC combat force. FARC is a Marxist-Leninist insurgency group that fought a generational war against the Colombian government. Up to 45% of FARC combatants are Colombian women. A major ideology within FARC is insurgent feminism, which tackles women's issues through a lens of anti-capitalism and class struggle. Women are barred by the Colombian government from serving in combat units, but FARC gives poor women the opportunity to fight against capitalism, which is the system they perceive to be the root of inequality, both class-wise and gender-wise. Within FARC itself, however, women may face a big degree of sexual violence. The UN and Amnesty International report that sexual violence is common in the camps, and several agencies claim that FARC has an institutional policy of forced contraception and forced abortion, which definitely undermines feminist claims and may undermine feminist international support. So when FARC and the Colombian government came together in Havana for peace talks, this was seen as a very good thing internationally and locally, even though eventually the resolution was voted down. Not resolution, it was it's one of those R words. But the peace talks were initially seen as a really great thing, just to make sure that the bloodshed stopped. So it also had women's issues at the forefront, which is really interesting, for especially those international relations theorists that are studying Colombia through the feminist kind of lens. So FARC's stated post-war primary directive was to reintegrate their female combatants into Colombian society, but the kind of catch to that was they didn't want them to be subjected to the same inequality that they attempted to escape from in the first place. So if a FARC combatant left home because their uncle or their father was abusing them, and they wanted to be able to fight to not be poor anymore, and so they joined FARC and started fighting in the insurgency group, it wouldn't have been much of a victory if those women were forced to go back to their homes and back to those male-dominated economic positions where they wouldn't have any advancement. So to the left in this picture is former FARC commander Victoria Sandino, and she was one of the leading members of the gender subcommittee that was established at the peace talks. She's just an important leader to the FARC in Colombia in general. The peace talks as a whole, I think, can be seen as a success for women's rights. There was even a confirmation in the ratified peace agreement that sexual violence is a non-pardonable offense in Colombia. However, there are some issues that were left unsolved by the talks. Some Colombians were concerned with the feasibility of the solutions to issues presented in the peace treaty. Obvious issues for success in public policy are usually capacity, capability, and available funding. So regardless of what we say we're going to do, all of those need to be there. Those directly contribute to efficacy of a policy. So there were concerns from Colombians about how effective these peace talk agreements were going to be in the long term. And another issue with the Havana talks is that they tended to exclude representation from indigenous women and women of African descent, even though they were fairly women forward, fairly dominant in talking about women's issues. So these women usually live in violent areas, and they definitely face harsher and economic and educational inequality due to their race in addition to their gender. Some of the biggest issues to people in these communities are neoliberal land policies, and these neoliberal land policies really conflict with how they would traditionally live. In addition, these women of color in these communities are largely excluded from having a voice when the Colombian government undertakes infrastructure projects in these poor areas. There's very little concern for what the regional inhabitants think, and especially these women of color. In my opinion, one of the best ways of combating female inequality and a lot of these issues in Colombia is the promoting of organized female interest groups. So the National Association of Indigenous and Peasant Women, it's NAIP on the slide. They formed, for example, to serve as a kind of a collective political outlet for those marginalized voices, those indigenous and peasant women. And a more niche example of this is the Association of Rural Women Almaguereñas. And so as you can see to the right, that we have a woman farming. And this association has the goal of establishing women as strategic economic organizers. And Amura also assists in education about how to use farming technology from farm to farm. So this is very clearly a very specific interest group about coffee farmers that happen to be women, but it actually was really efficacious in helping women economic independence. So it was initially resisted by different patriarchal parts of society, and especially in individual families resisted it because they feared changes in the woman's working roles outside of the home. But today the group serves as a testament to these group strategies, and that they do actually reduce female economic dependence on male activity. These women were able to organize together and essentially make their farms more productive, and they reduce their role for themselves working inside the home and being confined to the home. So, therefore were able to start making money for themselves in some ways. So I think that if there's one kind of solution or suggested solution I have to some of these issues of gender inequality in Colombia, it would be international support for these women's organizations. The UN Committee on Women has done a great job supporting both of these organizations that are listed, and a lot of other IOs do the same. So thank you for listening to this presentation. Here are some of the works I used in this presentation. A lot of UN articles were particularly helpful, and also the articles on insurgent feminism were very interesting and very helpful in kind of determining the path that I would take for this. So thank you for listening.